Welcome to Pursuing Justice. I'm Harriet Hendel. On our last podcast, we spoke to Amy Friedman, founder of P.O.P.S the Club. P.O.P.S means Pain of the Prison System. It's an after-school club for high school students who have a parent or a family member behind bars. Today, we are pleased to welcome John Rodriguez, a member of the P.O.P.S board, a former juvenile offender, a college grad, almost in June, he will have earned his BA. He's a writer and an activist. Very impressive. It's great to have you with us today. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, you have quite a story to tell. Where would you like to begin?
I think the best place to start is probably the classroom.
Okay.
So I say that because that's kind of where my connection to writing started. And when I was 17, I had encountered writing through a high school teacher. Before that, didn't really like writing. Wasn't into reading. Probably never read a book on my own up until probably around that age, 17. And the only thing I came closest to writing was tagging. So that was something that I used to do. That was my form of therapy. But I encountered a high school teacher who introduced writing. And it was something that was very, very new to me and something that opened up a different way of trying to understand myself and my situation at that age.
Okay. Now, in my introduction, I said that you were a former juvenile offender. Can you just tell us briefly how you came to be incarcerated, and then you had a wonderful thing happen thanks to Governor Brown?
Yes. So at 17, even though I had found writing and I found the classroom and the teacher who actually cared, I was still involved in living a certain type of lifestyle. And this ultimately led me to becoming incarcerated. I was still in high school. So on Friday, I was still going up to class and showing up for first period. But then by Monday, I was inside a county jail. And I didn't know it then, but that I would be spending a good chunk of my life behind bars. Even though I was only 17, I was tried as an adult and convicted as an adult and was given a sentence of 22 years.
Mm.
At that time, a sentence like that for a juvenile, especially the way the prison system was at the time, it was very unlikely that somebody would come home with a sentence like that, just because the multitude of violence that's inside. The chances of somebody catching extra time by catching an extra case is very, very high. But luckily what saved me was, again, writing. And this came through the form of letter writing with my high school teacher. Even though I was somebody who I thought was just a regular student to him, I think I meant much more to him. And even though we were two completely polar opposites, I was brown, he was white.
Mm-hmm.
I came from a different type of background. I didn't like writing. He loved writing. We began to build somewhat of a connection. And this to me was just having somebody who would listen to you. And that's something that really highly resonate P.O.P.S. So when people talk about P.O.P.S, I would like to say that my P.O.P.S came through the form of letter writing instead of the actual classroom.
I see.
And eventually, because of that, not just writing, but also doing the internal work, going to self-help classes, really understanding the childhood trauma and taking actual steps to improve that is what ultimately led me to have my sentence commuted by Governor Brown. And he reduced my 22-year sentence to a 9-year sentence.
Mm. Now, why do you think that that happened? And is that standard for a teen tried as an adult, given a pretty long sentence, that your sentence was commuted? How can you explain that?
I don't think at the time it was standard. I
Mm-hmm.
think something that's really picking up specifically in the state of California, because it's very, very progressive. Um, I think a lot of brain science is being done, really understanding that children's brains weren't fully developed up until the age of 25. And even though we knew science was behind this, right, there really wasn't a lot of legislation that was putting this forward. Um, but I think through the advocacy of a lot of folks out here, specifically a top advocate for me, which was Scott Budnick, a director of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. He
Mm-hmm.
really understood children. He understood that children weren't people that should be understood based off of one mistake that they made it their whole entire lives. Um, and he clearly saw that if you keep up with these children, follow them into the adult system, and if they have a proper support system, change will happen. Positive change will happen. And I think after just advocacy on this behalf, legislation started coming through. And so now it's something that I think we see a lot more regularly. But before it wasn't necessarily the case.
That's really an incredible thing. And now, did Scott, was he in touch with Governor Brown? Was he influential in the commutation, do you think?
Um, I I think so in the sense that he knew people, right? Like he has access to these people. It's something that a lot of folks don't necessarily have. So I don't know exactly how much of a part he played in it, but I think
Mhm.
just having access is a huge thing.
Oh, that's terrific. You mentioned brain science, and I've done a lot of reading about that, and it's something that is getting far more attention these days than maybe way long time ago. And one
Mhm.
of the things I read is children are not little adults, and
Mhm.
that is so very, very true. But we do know exactly what you said, that the prefrontal cortex is the last to finish developing, and that's where teens get into difficulty. That's the risk-taking part of the brain, the impulsivity, not thinking too far ahead, and saying, well, if I do this, this might be the result. That's not the way teens think. And I
Mhm.
think in understanding brain science, as you say, I think a number of changes have definitely occurred. So you were very fortunate. Now, how long have you been at home?
I've been home in August. It will be 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
And how does Pops the Club fit into this journey from prison to college where you are today? That's a very short amount of time you've been out, and you've certainly gotten involved in some very good things. So, what can you
Mhm.
tell us about that?
So there's a lot to learn. I think just sometimes I don't really like the term or the phrase re-entering the community.
Hmm.
Um, One, because even though our family members and our loved ones are displaced in deserts and far off areas away from inner cities, um, that's still our community. Whether they're locked up in prison, they're still our community, and we're still responsible for them. But in the traditional sense, re-entering the community, I began to understand things a little bit differently. Not only did I just pick up from, I went in at 17 and came home, and I was 26, about to turn 27, um, and I had to completely just play catch up. It felt like it, at least. Um, but also something that I discovered was that even though I was home, things weren't necessarily okay. A lot of the times I had this belief, or at least my mother, my brothers and sisters, we had not necessarily outspoken, but we had this internal belief that, you know what, things will be better. And they are. Um, but upon coming home, I noticed that there are a lot of gaps. I had to relearn to understand who my brothers and sisters were. I had to meet my mom again, right? And the new person that she was. And they also had to take in like the person who I was and how I had changed. And I began to notice that even though these things were occurring, not many people wanted to talk about it. It's hard to talk about it
Yeah,
because behind it, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of pain.
yeah,
Um, and that's what connected me to Pops
I see.
because I began to see that this this journey of incarceration not only affected me, it affected my whole community. It affected my neighbors that were inside the buildings where I lived at. It affected everybody, and this is a whole new world, completely new to me, because when you're inside, you receive letters, you get phone calls if you're fortunate, and if you have the privilege to do so. But we don't necessarily see the hurt, right? That's something that our families protect us from. Um, so
Right.
yeah.
Now, during your 8.5 years of incarceration, did you get visitors? Did your family visit you, and did they stay in touch by phone or letter?
Yeah, they did. My family would visit probably once or twice a year.
Mm-hmm.
I also had friends like Dennis who would come,
Uh-huh.
um, and everybody would continue to write. So I had a very, very strong support system that was advocating for me, that would support me, and that continues to do so.
How important is it for someone in prison to have an outside support system?
Um, I think it's pivotal, specifically people like Dennis, who not only was a high school teacher, right, but he chose to wear these different hats and he played different roles. He was also kind of like a counselor for me. He was also a father figure for me. Um, but this is integral because going in at that age, something that I don't know if other people can resonate with it, but what commonly happens is that the outside world, you kind of forget about it. You forget about the memories and the lived experiences that you have. And so I think it's essential to have those grounding points that remind you that, hey, you are still a community member, you are still loved, you are appreciated, and somebody does care about you. So that in the long run, you have something to look forward to. Because it's not something that I can speak from, but I wouldn't know how to grasp coming home and not having one single person that I knew who
Mm,
loved me to come home to.
that's true. Now, tell us a little bit more about your involvement with P.O.P.S, the club.
Yeah, so aside from being a board member, one thing that I first started off as a volunteer. Um, One, because I just remember that critical age. I knew what was going on in my life and all these decisions that I had to make, and ultimately I crumbled. I didn't know how to take that on. But one thing that I began to understand and get involved with was volunteering, because I was just amazed at some of the decisions that these kids were making. And sometimes I don't even like to use the word kids, but as you mentioned, they are kids. But sometimes it's sadly they act as adults because they're filling in shoes that they shouldn't have to. Um, but I just seen a lot of the work that they were doing, the leaps that they were taking, specifically in the classroom with writing. We use different forms of therapy. We use different outlets and how to communicate, how to express our emotions, something that I wasn't necessarily taught. But I see 15, 16, 17-year-olds doing this. And I'm like, y'all are way ahead of the game. I know 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds who still are scared to do the internal work. And I think it's so pivotal for them to have the safe space for them to do that. Um, and also, one thing that I admire about them is just the resilience that they have. Me as somebody who I didn't know I was a P.O.P.S kid technically in the beginning. My father was once incarcerated. My mother was once incarcerated. Two of my brothers were once incarcerated. So we come from a history of incarceration. Um, but one thing that I'm learning from them is how to continue to support those that are inside, because it's hurtful. It's hard. I think it's harder to do than just serving out your sentence. And I have a brother who's still, he's in jail. I have my best friend who's still serving